Okay, welcome everyone. I'll take a few minutes here just to let everybody join in, and we'll get started shortly. Hi Viva, hi Megan. Nice to see you.
Hello, Dr. Shields, Dr.
Hello.
Preston. Yeah, thank you so much for making time to present in our Lunch and Learn series. Thank you so much.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Yes.
Wonderful, and feel free to take a moment just to grab your lunch or a warm beverage. We have about an hour and a half of some really great learning today. Um, so yeah, get settled in. I just want to start by saying that we are recording, so the recording is in progress. So do just keep that in mind as you toggle your camera on or off. This recording will be available on our website. Hi, Amy.
Hello.
Welcome, Nadine. Great. I'm seeing some new names and some familiar names, which is always wonderful. Okay, great. We'll just allow people to keep filtering in, but just to be respectful of everyone's time, I'll go ahead and get started here. So really quickly, my name's Lindsay. I'm a research assistant with the University of Calgary and with K-Hub, which is the Newcomer Knowledge Hub. We have John Shields and Valerie Preston, who will be joining us, is joining us today, who will be discussing expanding temporary residence access to settlement services, lessons from recent initiatives. Some of you might recognize John. He was here back, I believe, last year in 2024. So just a few reminders before we start today's session. First, I just want to say thank you for carving out some time in your day to be part of this community. It's lovely that we can come together and share and learn. And before we dive in, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement, and I will invite you also to write your own land acknowledgement in the chat if you're tuning in from somewhere different, or if you maybe have something that's inspired you. Feel free to put that in the chat and join in. I myself am tuning in from the traditional territory of the Six Nations of the Grand River, as well as the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation today. So that is where I am speaking from. Immigrant Services Calgary head office is located on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tisuutina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Okay, great. Just a couple items of housekeeping. So please do mute yourself when you're not speaking, just to reduce some of that background noise. So yeah, if you are new to Microsoft Teams, we do have that mic button. If you see a diagonal line through it, that's a good indication that you are muted. If you have any questions, please do use the chat, or you can also use the raise hand function. Our presenters today have some time devoted at the end of the presentation for a Q&A period. So you can always put them in the chat, and then we'll certainly come back to your questions at the end. So as I mentioned, recording is in progress. We do take a few photos for our website and social media posts. So please do keep that in mind as you put your camera on or off. We do love to see your faces. We're also mindful that this is a lunch and learn, so many of you are taking this time to eat lunch together. So feel free to toggle that on depending on your comfort level. And here we have our QR code. So this registration page is for our Lunch and Learns. It is updated regularly. Our next Lunch and Learn will be Tuesday, April 29th. And we'll be hearing from Migrante, Alberta, where Nellie and Yasmin will join us to present on Philippine labor export policies and also the challenges that people face as they're recruited from the temporary foreign worker program. So we do hope to see you all there. And we also have launched our newsletter, our first issue in 2025. So we have our second one coming out on April 15th. So this basically details any of our research studies. It also details our upcoming events and any other resources pertaining to the settlement sector. Okay, so the last thing before we get to hear from our wonderful presenters is our monthly poll. So as always, if 70% of us or more would like a refresher on Gateway or K-Hub, I will do a quick overview of these initiatives for us. Just bear with me here as I launch this poll. And hopefully you can all see that. Okay, I'll just take a minute to see those responses coming in. Okay, great. It looks like we don't need a refresher for this session. So we will move it on over to John and Valerie here. Great. And I'll just pull up the slides for us. Okay, wonderful. So welcome, John. Welcome, Valerie. We're so happy to have you with us today and to learn from you. And feel free to get started.
Okay, I'm going to lead this off, and then Valerie is going to jump in, and then I'm going to close it out, and then we'll be open for questions. So we'll do a little bit of switching here. So I did want to welcome and wish everybody a good afternoon. Valerie and I are certainly very pleased to be with you today, and we want to for sure thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to share our work with you, and we certainly look forward to feedback from the audience and your questions. I do want to say that K-Hub is really, I think, a really valuable and a timely initiative that's really needed in these very challenging times. And we are certainly very enthusiastic about building our connection with our own work and our research network with this particular initiative. So thank you again. And I think we can move to the next slides. Before I get into the talk itself, I should say a little bit about the origins of where this came from. And basically, it's based on building migrants' resilience in cities, so-called BMRC policy review that Valerie and I did, along with Haya Ali, who's a master's student, a student who actually finished her master's degree in public policy and administration from Ryerson. I'm sorry, let me try that again. From Toronto Metropolitan University. I was at Ryerson for a very long time, so I keep calling it that. From Toronto Metropolitan University. We published that online as part of the BMRC website in late January of this year, and that's the link to the actual report. So a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about comes directly from that report, but we've also added some other material to it. And I should just say also a few words about BMRC. And that is a link, and I certainly invite everybody to take a look at the website. I think there really is a wealth of information on there that would be of interest to most of the people attending. And it's academic, policy-focused research as well as more practical research that's available on the website. And just in terms of background, BMRC was a SSHRC-funded partnership grant that allowed us to bring together a group of academic and community-based researchers and practitioners together to engage in research related to immigration and settlement and social resilience. And this is led by Valerie from York University. And it really, I think, has brought together an impressive array of people, and it's allowed us over a good number of years now to really explore this topic of social resilience. And that allows us to show how institutions like nonprofit settlement agencies in cities facilitate migrant settlement. So once again, I certainly invite people to take a look at the website. Next slide, please. I think to begin, we need to acknowledge that Canada, as a settler society, has an extensive history of immigration policy, which remains to this very day very central to Canada's economic and social well-being. In the more latter part of that history, what we've seen is considerable innovation in the immigration system, and much of that has been positive, including the settlement programming, which is considered a best practice. But it's a system that is under increasing strain and increasing policy shifts, which does call into question some of the more positive directions of immigration policy in the last decades. Newcomers, it must be emphasized, settle on services like those provided by immigrant settlement agencies. Of course, that's a system that receives public funding for settlement services delivered by nonprofit agencies. And that's a system that does stand in great contrast with the United States, for example, which has a much more laissez-faire approach to its settlement, and I think one that is much more compromising to immigrant communities. These services really do help to build communities and social resilience, especially with vulnerable populations. And over the years, this has fostered a two-way street system of settlement and integration, but it has also been one that has been centered on permanent resident immigrants and has ignored, in large measure, the growing temporary migrant population. And I think this reflects one of the significant gaps in terms of access to settlement services today. So like temporary migrants are really a manifestation of one of the real gaps in settlement services. There's other gaps as well, of course, but this lack of access to paid funded services for temporary migrants is a big one. And yet that is a situation where these migrants, where these temporary migrants, continue to contribute very significantly to our economy and society. You know, these migrants pay taxes. They are performing many of the essential services, as we found during the pandemic. And yet they're excluded from a lot of these services that are needed for them to be able to settle within our communities and to improve their lives and to the productivity of the country itself. Next slide, please. Temporary migrants' inability or I'm sorry, ineligibility, I should say, for settlement program is an example of the contradictions, I think, within our current government immigration policies. And it's a gap that has long been identified by settlement agencies themselves. We need to acknowledge the work, in fact, of nonprofit providers in this setting for continuing to provide as best they can services without IRCC funding to this vulnerable migrant group. And they do that, of course, because they're guided by their missions to serve. And yet this burden to fill these gaps in these services has fallen on ISAs without the necessary resources, without the necessary capacities, really, to fully do this job. And this is a case, once again, of the nonprofit sector doing more with less. They provide a thin protective layer to our communities, a situation that's become even more precarious with recent settlement funding cutbacks by IRCC. And we'll say a little bit more about some of those cutbacks a little bit later in this presentation. Next slide, please. So what do we do then in this particular presentation? Well, first of all, we identify what we see as the problem here. Secondly, we argue, we make the case for the need to expand eligibility for settlement services for temporary migrants. Third, we outline the changes, at least in brief, we outline the changes in Canada's international migration that necessitates changing eligibility for these services. And we draw on numerous examples of extending eligibility for some settlement services to temporary migrants that have already sort of taken place. Some of this has taken place at the provincial level. Some of this has taken place, as Valerie's going to explain, with some federal programs. But probably most noteworthy, it's taking place in the case of Quebec, which has been sort of a leading example of the expansion of coverage to temporary migrants. And the Quebec case is really something that we're saying that should be adopted and probably enhanced somewhat more even at the rest of Canada level. And then finally, we also offer some critique of the direction of immigration and settlement policy at the national level since the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So just in terms of setting the context a little bit here. Over the last few decades, there has been some very rapid shifts in Canadian immigration and settlement policies, with very large numbers of pilot programs and an increasing complex system, and in fact, a rather confusing system in many regards in terms of immigration policies and programming. And this has done a number of things. One is very much it's increased the number of migrants within the country. Both permanent residents, but also very significantly temporary migrants. And Valerie's going to take over with the next slide. Don't switch the slides yet, but she'll talk a little bit more about those numbers. Immigration, I should also say, is still a priority, even with some of the cutbacks that have recently happened. because of our aging population. And because the labor force, if it's going to meet skill deficits, if it's going to be able to grow and develop, and of course support an aging population, we depend, and will depend into the future for a very long time on large numbers of immigrants coming into the country. So even with the cutbacks, this is not to say that immigration does not remain a priority area. It certainly does. And I would also obviously emphasize the fact that settlement services are increasingly important in that kind of context, and we'll make that argument. But of course, what has happened is that we have a lot of these things have been tempered in various ways by right-wing political currents that we see across the world, but also within Canada, and changing domestic politics, including shifting public opinion about immigration. But to a large degree, a lot of that shifting public opinion is driven by an unfortunate trend that has been, and that's by policymakers as well as the media, to blame immigrants for a lot of the problems that Canada has, affordability problems, including areas around housing. And that's an obvious misinterpretation of what's happening, but it has taken a certain type of toll on the favorability of immigration within the country. Although compared to other countries, these are still pretty good numbers overall. One of the most, I think, profound changes in Canadian immigration policy has been the development of so-called two-step migration pathways, where temporary migrants are transitioned to permanent migrant status. And in fact, that movement from temporary to permanent is very much a preferred pathway in many ways to permanence in Canada over the last number of years, of decades. In fact, the most recent immigration levels plan have said that they will take a minimum of 40% of the new permanent residents out of the temporary group of immigrants who are already here, which I think speaks to the idea that actually these are people who are going to become permanent, and they actually need settlement services for better settlement and integration into Canadian society. So that does raise a question, and that is, how well do current eligibility criteria for funded settlement services, how does that system really serve settlement and integration needs within Canada today? Is there really evidence, and strong evidence now, for extending those services to temporary migrant populations? And on that note, I'll hand it, we can switch slides, and I'll hand it over to Valerie to take over here. And I'm not sure where my off switch is, but I'll keep quiet. Oh.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to show you a few graphs. And I want you all to take a deep breath. This is not going to be too bad, but I'm showing them to you because the dramatic changes in Canadian migration policy just jump off the page at you. And I was shocked when I looked at these graphs. We all know temporary migration has increased. We know that international students have increased, et cetera, but these graphs really get your attention. So the first one I have in front of you right now is about the number of temporary residents with a work or study permit admitted into Canada from 2014 to 2022. And the number of study permit holders are essentially international students. And you can see their numbers increase quite steadily, largely due to the universities in Ontario and British Columbia, by the way, and the colleges in those two provinces. Until 2019, the pandemic comes, Canada closes its borders, and then after 2020, the numbers simply accelerate. So that in 2022, we were admitting over 550,000 international students. There are two groups of temporary workers. The first group that we're all more familiar with in the long term is the aqua colored line at the bottom. These are temporary foreign workers for whom employers have to show that there is no qualified Canadian for the job. They have to get a labor market impact assessment. And that includes things like the seasonal agriculture workers program is included in there, for example. And you can see those numbers have increased, but much more slowly than the international students. And then there's this program called International Mobility. And it's the one that has mirrored what's happening with international students. And the reason for that is the International Mobility Program, employers apply for permission to hire a worker who they've already identified. And this is the program under which international students who have graduated and who have a work permit are allowed to work in Canada. So as the number of international students has increased annually, and as they graduate, you get more and more people in the International Mobility Program. The other thing that's happened is that we now permit this, or we did until very recently, but certainly over this time period, we permitted the spouses of international students to have work permits, and they also tended to get their work permits under the International Mobility Program. There are some other categories, but those are the two big ones. But I want you to notice how quickly those numbers go up after the beginning of the pandemic. They just go, you know, I don't usually see graphs that are that vertical. It's really impressive to me. So if I can have the next slide, let's have a look at permanent residents. So here are the permanent residents admitted during the same period. Both the Conservative and the federal and the Liberal federal governments have favored, as you can see, economic class admissions. Those have exceeded the other categories every year. The other three categories are family-sponsored immigrants, refugees, and protected persons. These are largely people identified abroad, but when asylum seekers become admitted as refugees, they get added into that number. And then there's a grab bag of humanitarian and compassionate and other, which is always relatively small. And again, you can see that the pandemic starts, we close the borders, nobody's allowed to come, and then Zoom. In response to employers calling for a way to resolve labor shortages, the government admits lots of economic class immigrants, but as well, there are increases that go along with that in family-sponsored class, and then there are some increases in refugees as we open up the borders. Now, what's really interesting, 2021, in order to come close to meeting their targets for permanent residents, the government admitted permanent residents, and almost half of them had been temporarily in Canada. It was a big increase in this two-step migration. And it is an increase that the government sees as having been really fairly successful, because as John said, and we're going to come to this in a little bit, their plan is in the future to admit more permanent residents who have been temporary in Canada. So I hope that has explained these two graphs and everybody's not too upset about them. So let me go to where were we in 2023? The next slide. So in 2023, and this is the slide that when I put it together, I couldn't believe it. Okay. I want you to look on the left-hand side first. You'll see that temporary admissions in 2023 were almost 1.8 million people. I knew that would get people's attention. In contrast, total permanent admissions in 2023 were less than 500,000. So there is almost a 4 times difference in the number of people admitted on a temporary basis than the number admitted on a permanent basis. Yeah, I agree. And I want you to know these numbers come from the 2024 annual report to Parliament on immigration. So they are IRCC's own numbers. When we look at the temporary admissions in 2023, the largest group is that international mobility program, predominantly made up of, not completely, but predominantly, of international students who graduated and got their work permit. There's a much smaller number of temporary foreign workers being admitted under the criterion that there is a successful labor market impact assessment. And there is over 600,000 international students being admitted. I'm not going to say much more about asylum claims. And the reason for that is the government admits that the number of asylum claims is really not something it can plan very well for or predict. We know that, for example, in at Roxham Road, before the Safe Third Country Agreement was revised, we saw a big increase in the number of asylum claims. That increase has now died down. And most people who are making asylum claims are coming to Canada by air, as they have historically. If we look at the permanent admissions, there's not much change in the composition. It's still predominantly economic class migrants, permanent residents, as well as their families, because don't forget, that category includes the principal applicant and his or her family. There are family-sponsored immigrants, not as many grandparents as many families would like to see. This is a real sore point in the area where I live, and refugees as the third category. So, but what is such a surprise to me is seeing how in 2023, the admissions on a temporary basis versus a permanent basis the permanent admissions were just so outnumbered. This is important because we know from the long history of research about integration in Canada that immigrants settle very successfully without any services. The last estimate I saw was about 20%. At least if you only consider their incomes. But most immigrants benefit from the suite of services, at least some of those services, that are offered to them on a publicly funded basis. Orientation, job workshops, information sessions, language training. These temporary residents are going to be the pool from which about half of permanent admissions are going to be drawn. And they go years and years without those services. And through this partnership that John and I are part of, we have also done some research with international students, some temporary foreign workers in both programs. And without exception, those temporary residents ask why they cannot access settlement services and other publicly funded services that permanent residents are eligible to receive. So on that note, let me turn to the next slide. Lindsay, the next slide. So we were, looking at those numbers, we were kind of going, whoa. And so fortunately, Haya then went and she scoured the public record looking for some examples of programs that have been provided to temporary residents so we could get a handle on what was being done and how it was being done. And there are recent examples of expanded eligibility. And those recent examples have occurred as the numbers of temporary residents have increased. And so she looked on websites, she looked in the gray literature, we found everything we could find. But this is a preliminary piece of research. So we're drawing mostly on publicly available sources. And this is not the final word, but it's very suggestive. So we want to talk about 3 programs: the Ukrainian authorization for emergency travel. I'm sitting in Detroit, Michigan, which is why I look so peculiarly yellow, because I don't want you to see the unmade hotel bed behind me. And it occurred to me that I am talking to an audience that knows more about the Ukrainian program than I am ever going to learn. So I look forward to being corrected. Because it's you guys out there in the prairies who have really been providing those services. We also want to talk about the Migrant Worker Support Program and then various provincial initiatives, especially in Quebec. Now, these programs are not all of the programs offered to temporary residents, but we chose them because they have a broad reach. They affect international students, the 2 groups of temporary foreign workers, as well as asylum seekers. And they're also ones we could find a fair amount about. So this is not a complete, but it is as comprehensive as we could make it. So if we can have the next slide, let's talk about the Canadian-Ukrainian authorization for emergency travel. In 2022, as Russia invaded Ukraine, and if anybody would like to correct my language, feel free. But there was a real public support for Ukraine. And in response to that public support and advocacy on the part of Ukrainian Canadians as individuals and the churches and other associations to which they belonged, Canada opened its doors. They offered admission and 3-year temporary visas to an unlimited number of Ukrainians wanting to come to Canada. They facilitated their migration by simplifying the application process. They provided immediate access to work permits, study permits, and access to many different publicly funded services, including settlement services. And for example, Ukrainians were eligible for publicly funded hotel stays when they first arrived. Probably not long enough, but it was at least something. They were also eligible for income support to the tune of about $3,000 per adult and $1,500 per child. They got the full suite of federally funded settlement services, language training, information and orientation, assistance with enrolling kids in school, support for accessing the labor market, some activities to foster community connections, assessments of additional needs, referrals, etc. And the federal government was, in all of its pronouncements, and Haya found a lot of them, remained open to considering additional services as needed. And in fact, they have extended people's temporary visas, although the requirements for extending work permits and study permits are more onerous. Several provinces also made Ukrainians eligible for services. So, for example, where I live normally in Ontario, the province made Ukrainians eligible for OHIP, which is no small change. They also funded some settlement services. Many provinces gave money to agencies. What's interesting to me about this is how comprehensive the services are. And also, they were delivered by a mix of agencies. First of all, the immigrant serving agencies provided those services, but there were also Ukrainian groups and associations that provided services. And in addition, the Red Cross, for example, took on its role of meeting people at the airport. I remember being at the airport to pick up people and seeing the workers from the Red Cross there with signs in Ukrainian, inviting people to come and talk to them and provide them some help. So can we have the next slide, Lindsay? How well has it worked? Well, the supply of services has not met demand. We know that. The program, nevertheless, is really important because it breaks all the rules about restricted eligibility for services of temporary residents. It says it doesn't matter if you're temporary. Yeah, we expect you to go home after 3 years, but we're still going to give you all the services as if you were a permanent resident. And what I learned, which many of you may know, particularly those in BC, this isn't the first time that a full suite of services has been offered to temporary residents. The Kosovars receive very similar access to services. And as many of my colleagues have pointed out, the treatment of Ukrainians has been very different from the contemporaneous treatment of Sudanese and Afghans. And people have actually said, you know, what's going on here? It's very similar to the Syrians' resettlement effort, in that many of the settlement agencies involved in resettling Syrians pointed out that the level of public support was such that they were able to provide.
Is that okay to ask question here, please?
In just 1 minute.
Okay.
Hi, Jonas. We'll just be taking some questions at the end, if that's okay. So we'll have a portion at the end of the presentation where we can definitely take your question first.
Yeah, I do not want to forget that. Why are other nations treated differently with the Ukrainians? Can you answer that question, please? Because that's very important to our community.
If I, you know what?
We have
if
a
I
lot
knew
of
the
people.
answer, I would tell you.
Yeah,
we have do you want to hear my suspicion?
Yeah.
On the surface, it looks like racism. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
I do not think, okay, so now let me say the rest of my answer. I think where the differentiation comes in is, as I've written down here, the Kosovars and the Ukrainians were seen as the government acting to evacuate people, with all the connotations of you got to do something right away. Those people are going to go back. There is an implicit assumption that people from Sudan and Afghanistan who many might argue are in even more dangerous situations in many cases, are not going to go back.
Why?
Well, we can talk about that at the end, but I agree
Is it,
with
is it an
you.
assumption? Is it an assumption, or just is there any data that all Ukrainians will go back? I'm not
Well,
just signaling out Ukrainians,
okay,
but any other nationals will stay or go.
okay.
Uh,
The Sudanese and Afghans who do come to Canada, or at least the Afghans for sure, are offered permanent residence. So then you have to go through the whole security process. You guys know the details of this more than I do, right? It's a lengthy, time consuming. If you don't have the UNHCR to do the initial screening, they really takes forever. Okay. And it leaves people at risk for a long time.
that's the same. That
Oh, no.
process does not
I
apply.
hear the contradiction
Does
you're
not apply
raising.
to Ukrainians. Do you think that all the Afghans or Sudanese are more dangerous to
I
the
think
Canadian society? That's absurd. That's
I think
unacceptable.
I think that one of the questions that this
Sorry.
program raises, and I'm going to leave it after this comment, is for,
If I
whom are we
may,
willing to offer
sorry, Dr.
services?
Preston. Sorry, Dr. Preston, if I may interject. Thank you, Jonas, for your question. But can we please take the discussion to the end of the conference presentation and not be respectful of the format of the presentation and not interrupt Dr. Preston as she's presenting? We will definitely come back to your question at the end of the presentation.
Sorry to interrupt. Sorry.
I think that Jonas, you points to a very important contradiction that is apparent to all of us, and is one that I have heard voiced by settlement workers themselves. And it is one we need to struggle with. I think the other reason why this experiment, and it is viewed as an experiment, has occurred is because the Canadian public has been very mobilized and in favor of supporting Ukrainians. So Lindsay, if we go to the next program for temporary residents on the next slide, the Migrant Workers Support Program was instituted by Economic and Social Development Canada, the federal department that actually manages the TFW programs requiring a labor market impact assessment. So, and it comes out of the pandemic. And the idea was to reduce the abuse and mistreatment that faced many temporary workers, especially in the agricultural sector during the pandemic. When they got caught in Canada, they couldn't travel. They were living in circumstances that left them very vulnerable to transmission of the virus. ESDC provides information services upon arrival at the airports, at a few airports in Canada. It then provides orientation and information services to workers. It gives them some legal support, and it provided some emergency services. And the idea is really to deal with this workplace mistreatment and abuse. But the program also emphasizes community resources. There is a real attempt to take workers, many of whom are quite isolated in small towns, rural areas, and try and connect them with ongoing services. So there's some provision of transportation to community facilities. There are some social events and meetings. Those services have been offered by more than 110 different nonprofit agencies across Canada. And what's really interesting about it is, from my perspective, it is a real attempt to do outreach to small cities and small towns and rural areas. Historically in Canada, settlement services, as you guys know better than I do, have been concentrated in the bigger cities. But this has really been an attempt to make at least some of these services available in parts of Canada that haven't historically had a lot of access. These services are only available to people who enter Canada under the TFW or the Global Mobility Program. And that means they are not available to international students because international students change their visa status. Okay. And their spouses change their visa status after they come to Canada. The services are delivered by nonprofit organizations, some of which are immigrants serving agencies of long standing, and some of which have been much more focused on employment issues and have not been so involved in providing settlement services. I see there are 2 errors on this slide, for which I apologize. The organizations that advocate for permanent residency for temporary workers do not provide these services. They have not been asked to provide these services, which I just mention as an observation. So if we can have the next slide, Lindsay. This is an initial step, but I want you to notice the services are limited. There's no language training, for example, and that became particularly relevant when there was a pilot program to allow agricultural workers to apply for permanent residency, and there weren't enough agricultural workers who actually met the language requirements. There also are not any job workshops to help people prepare for occupations in demand outside agriculture, or outside the broader agro sector. The eligibility is limited, and there is a question of, are all the agencies providing those services? Some are very well positioned, but for some this is new. The reason for these support program is that during the pandemic, as I mentioned, agricultural workers particularly, but not just the farm workers, other temporary workers in the agro sector, there was some question about how well they were being treated, and employers continue to lobby to expand the temporary worker programs. And so ESDC has begun this program with the goal of, if we are going to admit more temporary workers, let's ensure that they're aware of their rights, that they know how to advocate for those rights. If they can't do it themselves, who to reach out to, etc. So I think it's a very important program because it is one that is made available to a stream of temporary residents who have not historically had any services. But it's interesting to me, it's funded by Economic and Social Development Canada, and it is fairly limited in its scope. So now the third example, Lindsay, if we can go to the next slide, is provincial initiatives. Now, as you guys know better than I do, immigration has always been a shared jurisdiction, but provinces didn't used to pay a lot of attention to it. That started changing around 1991, at least in the post-war period, with the Quebec-Canada Accord, and then the development and growth of provincial nominee programs and various regional initiatives. And with that devolution has come more provincial interest in providing settlement services. Most of these initiatives exclude or only partially take account of asylum seekers because asylum seekers are supposed to be funded by the federal government. There's lots of debate about this, et cetera, et cetera. We can talk about it. In 2019, Quebec expanded service eligibility. Quebec controls settlement services in the province of Quebec. The suite of services that are offered are similar in many ways to those provided with federal funds across the rest of Canada. But of course, they emphasize learning the French language. And in 2019, they expanded their service eligibility to international students, temporary foreign workers, and asylum seekers. There are some important differences. For example, in Quebec, you are only eligible for settlement services, including language training, within the first 5 years of residence. Whereas in the rest of Canada, you're eligible until you become a citizen. Now, we can talk about what that distinction means. In Quebec as well, the expansion of settlement services was accompanied by some expansion of publicly funded services, although there has been lots of court cases and debates about that. But in theory, in Quebec, people who are international students who come as temporary foreign workers, and who are asylum seekers should be able to get access to the same settlement services as permanent residents admitted to Quebec. Others provinces provide more limited services. So, for example, in Ontario, we have a Connect program for international students. It's a great program. The agency that runs it, Connect, partners with university and colleges and provides information to international students about a whole host of issues, including housing and the landlord-tenant rights, et cetera, et cetera. They provide some information about how to make the transition from being an international student to a work permit. The problem is that the funding is insufficient relative to the demand. And so most of the information is offered online rather than in person. And it is not offered on a one-on-one basis. It's offered through sort of large groups. And only the only students who could access that information were students whose higher education institution had signed on. Manitoba, for example, allows TFWs who apply through the provincial nominee program to access some settlement services as well. And also some other publicly funded services once they apply for permanent residence. And in some cases, they get language training even before they apply. What this means is we have variable, depending on which province you go to, you get access to a different suite of services. And in most provinces, not all, but most, it's a selective set of services. The provincial programs for asylum seekers tend to be more limited. And in most cases, the provinces rely on the same immigrant service agencies that are already serving permanent residents. This means they can take advantage of those agencies' long experience, and many of them have been trying to serve temporary residents sort of off the side of their desk, at least outside Quebec, for a long time. But it also means that temporary residence settlement service needs are being shoehorned in with permanent residents. So Lindsay, if we can have the next slide. So what we've got is a patchwork. Services for temporary residents are expanding, but they vary. And the funding is insufficient, even in Quebec. We chair of the board of the TCFE, the umbrella organization for immigrant serving agencies in Quebec, came to and spoke about the impact of this expanded mandate. And she just said they're just not getting sufficient programming, sufficient funding. And the reason for that is that temporary migrants don't need specialized programs. They don't need the exact same programs that we're already offering to permanent residents. For example, international students they do need an introduction to the Canadian job market, but it's a different introduction to the Canadian job market than someone who just got off a plane and has not done any pre-arrival services. They come out of their study programs with some knowledge, sometimes incorrect, but some. Their colleges and universities give them some help, and therefore they need much more targeted job information. And the federal funding for settlement services for permanent residents doesn't fund that as well. And in Quebec, what they're finding is that stretching the additional funding they've got to create these more specialized programs is expensive. Why do this? Well, as we know, the number of temporary migrants in Canada who need services is becoming a much more public issue. Two-stage migration creates a real onus and responsibility to ensure that temporary migrants are ready for this transition to be permanent. The idea that they can just settle on their own is one that is debunked by study after study from Statistics Canada, which shows that although people who go through two-stage migration, particularly international students, do better in the job market, at least initially, than people who are right off the plane arriving in Canada as permanent residents, they still don't get the same earnings as equally qualified Canadian-born Canadian residents. The other thing is that there's a real mandate issue. The current immigrant settlement agencies are well positioned to provide services to temporary residents. They have the experience. In many cases, they've been, at least in Ontario, trying to serve these people for a long time. But they want to be able to have a sufficient funding to actually improve their services and target them to temporary residents. They know better than anybody else that temporary residents need slightly different services. So Lindsay, the next page. So that's where we were in 2023. These programs were all in effect, and IRCC had a call for proposals. This call for proposals, and many of you may have participated in it, was really an opportunity to assess what had happened during the pandemic. And in fact, immigrant serving agencies had really done a remarkable job providing services to people who had just come to Canada at a time when they most needed them. Out of the consultation came 3 recommendations that there be an effort to better address the evaluation criteria that are used to evaluate the funding for settlement services so that it reflected more real integration outcomes. Integration does involve more than your income. That's not to say incomes don't matter. They do, but there is more to integration than just economic integration. Secondly, there was a request for improved coordination among government funders, especially between IRCC and the provinces. And this came from the experience during the pandemic, when in fact the provinces and IRCC funding worked quite well together. We've heard from at least agencies in Ontario. And finally, there was a real request to fill some of these settlement service gaps, particularly for temporary migrants. So Lindsay, in the next, so what happened in 2024? Not sure what happened, but it was not a good time. Immigrants and international students were blamed publicly for the housing crisis in Canada. Housing costs went through the roof, and we had government ministers coming out and blaming international students. I've been studying immigration a long time. I've never seen anything like it in my life. In addition to that, surveys showed declining public support for immigration. And let me just check the numbers, but I think the question, only 48% of Canadians in telephone surveys in November 2023 thought the number of immigrants coming to Canada was just right. And when you use the term immigrants in a public survey, people aren't making a big distinction between permanent residents and temporary residents. They're just lumping everybody together. Now, I went back and looked at those numbers. We have had equally low public support in that question in the past, but not for some years. And this was interpreted as Canadians are saying immigration is out of control. And part of that had to do with pictures coming from Roxham Road. I think, my colleagues and I will write 10 papers about that question. But there was definitely lots of headlines. The third thing that changed is we began to see a shift towards austerity again. There was more and more public conversation that Canada's deficit was growing, that the federal government had become too expensive, spending too much money, and it was time to cut back. So this leaves the question of what happens to these services for temporary residents if we're at the end of building back better after the pandemic. And with that, I'll leave it to John.
Yeah. So next slide, please, Lindsay. Yeah. So what was then the response from the federal government? And to go over just a little bit further some of the points that Valerie has raised here. Well, I think what we found in the post-pandemic period with a changed political climate, the federal Liberal government changed its policy direction quite significantly. And the progressive promise to pursue a path guided by Build Back Better has really been abandoned, and an austerity agenda of one shape or another has been embraced. Now, they might call it sometimes a fiscal responsibility agenda, but really it's the old style austerity agenda. And I think we can see that in terms of some of the cuts that I'll talk about shortly to settlement services. And this has had a great impact at a number of levels. One has to do with the actual changes in immigration levels plans, and I'll talk about that in the next slide a little bit more fully. Another area here was that during the pandemic, there was a real shift in terms of a cooperative approach with settlement agencies during the pandemic to treat each other with greater, I think, respect from the federal government to the agencies. There was a lot of transparency and open communication with those agencies. There was a lot of support for those agencies to make adjustments to online services. So there was a real sort of building of a real kind of partnership idea on a more equal type of basis. I'm not saying it was fully equal, but certainly much more in that direction. And what we saw in the post-pandemic period is a real retreat from that. And again, I'm going to say a few more things about that in a slide or two. The other thing is that we see is very deep cuts to IRCC staffing as well. I think over 3,000 staff members from the department are being laid off. And I think that tells us about where some of the priorities are or are not. So it's not just settlement agencies being cut, but it's the department itself that has been hit quite a bit. Obviously, we've had the election of Donald Trump, and that does create both economic and political instability in Canada as well as elsewhere. The one thing I would say about that is that, interestingly, such crises can also open up policy windows. And it certainly has changed the dynamic at the federal level, I think, in terms of immigration in obviously some very negative ways. But there is, in a more hopeful, I guess, way, I think it's also generated a more progressive form of Canadian nationalist response, with some possibilities, at least, of perhaps opening an agenda to talk about more progressive types of ideas. I'm not sure I'm fully seeing that yet, but I think there's some, certainly at the ground level, I'm seeing some of this. Certainly reactions against the idea of MAGA-like policies more generally. So we'll see how that develops. But I guess at this stage, we definitely see a far less favorable immigration policy environment in which we're working at, and that everybody, I guess, has to attempt to sort of manage through in various ways. Next figure, please. Next slide. And here, I just want to use a few tables to take a look at the changed levels numbers. And the first graph here is about temporary immigration levels and the plans going forward. And on the far left-hand side, you see the actuals for 2023 of temporaries, and not sure how well you can see the small print there, but the blue line, or the blue graph, is the total number of temporary migrants. The orangey one is about temporary workers, and the gray one has to do with international students. And we see those numbers are quite robust in 2023. But then when we look at the proposed numbers to be brought in 25, 26, and 27, what we see is dramatic declines in those proposed numbers. And I should say that the temporary migration numbers up until now have not been part of levels plans. So in 2024, they changed that scenario at the end of 2024, and they now are including temporary into the levels plans overall. So now we actually have some numbers. The tracking of temporary immigrants is not so great within Canada. So we have good, I think, estimates, but they are kind of estimates. So those numbers we're not tracking so well, or at least haven't been tracking so well, about those who are leaving. The other, I guess, thing I would say here is that obviously we've got big downward shifts taking place, but that's especially the case for temporary foreign workers. They've really, if you look over those figures over 2025 to 2027, they've been especially a hit in terms of those numbers. Having said all of that there's big shifts underway, absolutely. But there still are many temporary migrants that are within the country. About 3 million are currently in the country. There has been some decline over this last couple of quarters, but not dramatic declines at this stage. So there's going to remain a significant presence for some time of temporary migrants within the country. And many of those temporaries are going to be transferred into permanent residence. So there's a real pent-up demand here for settlement services going forward. And the plan is right now, I said there was about 3 million is the estimate of temporary migrants within the country. That's about 7% of the population. Their goal is to bring it down to 5%. So even with the economic stresses within the country, there is still big demand on the part of employers for continuing significant numbers of temporary migrants to fill job vacancies and job skills gaps. Next slide, please. This one deals with the issue of permanent immigration levels plans. And I think if we look at the left-hand side of this figure, what it's doing is looking at what the projections were, what the plans were for that were set out in 2023 for the years 2024, 2025, and 2026. And again, the blue line graph figure is the total. The orangey one is the economic. Family class is the gray, and refugees are the yellow figures. And I think if you look at the shift here to the right-hand side, that's what the current levels plans call for. And what it's showing, of course, is significant declines in terms of how many permanent immigrants will be brought into the country for all classes. I should also say, however, that the cuts in terms of permanent are not as dramatic as the cuts for temporaries. They're significant, but they're not as dramatic in terms of the temporary cuts. And I should also note that as a country, by comparative standards, we still are calling for relatively high immigration levels. And it still rests above the figures for example, 2015 to 2018, which were in the low 300,000s. We're still, into the high 300,000s here. So comparatively, these are significant cuts for sure. But we haven't, completely retreated on this. There's still a good number that are wanted in terms of the economy. And I suspect this number is actually too low, but that's another set of debates. And of course, these numbers today are still going to be below population replacement and labor market renewal rates. So it's going to put some strains on those aspects of what Canadian needs are going forward if those numbers are sustained over a longer period of time. Next slide, please. And so what I want to just raise here is, what about some of the changes to settlement service funding? And I guess all of you are very aware that there have been some recent cuts to settlement service funding that has caused some pain. And in fact, that pain is going to continue because these cuts are going to continue over the first year is in, but there's 2 more years of this to come. And each of those other 2 years, the cuts are going to be deeper than the current levels are at. And what we found is that, and we're still, trying to document exactly what this has meant overall, because all of the details of it are not fully revealed. But the federal cuts have hurt some agencies far more than other agencies, and they've also hurt some provinces more than others. And it's been particularly impactful, I think, for those provinces that were more reliant upon the provincial nomination programs, which very much hits Western Canada more, because those P&P numbers have been cut by the federal government quite significantly. The other thing I think that's very much worth noting here is that there's been no provision to those agencies that have experienced the cuts for things like severance payments that they have to make to the workers that they've had to lay off. Those are burdens that have to be absorbed by the agencies themselves, or who are already underfunded. And also, they may have to close down some of their space that they've rented and break leases, which again is another cost onto the agencies. So the burden of these cuts, the invisible parts of those kind of burdens, are even more severe than just the cuts themselves. Another thing that has happened is that there's been a shift from the 5-year funding model now to a 3-year funding model. And that's quite significant, because that movement to a 5-year model was very helpful, because it allowed agencies to better plan into the future. There's less ability to plan now, and now there's also this idea about a 3-year funding model is, well, what happens after 3 years? This idea of stability going forward, I think, is very much put into question. And again, I think that is very challenging for the settlement sector as a whole. Another very interesting and troubling change is that there's going to be no funding for enhanced language programs after September 2026, which is really quite well, not just interesting, but alarming, because we know just how important language programs are. Why that's become a target for cuts speaks, at least it tells me, that this is about austerity. This is not about the effectiveness of programs. We should be heavily investing more into language, not sort of cutting back in that particular area. The other point I would note is that these changes were really announced without real consultation. There was very little forewarning. I mean, people, I think, were wary that there were cuts coming, but where the cuts came, how deep they were, I think, was really a little bit of a shock to the system. And it certainly contradicted a lot of the discussions and tone that were had during the 2024 consultation process that was held at the end of 2023 for the 2024 new, what was supposed to be the new 5-year funding turned into 3-year. And of course, the cuts have been very much justified in terms of revised levels plans, that there be fewer immigrants coming into the country, and therefore fewer services were to be required. So that's kind of the rationale, if you will, that was used by the government. But we already know that agencies are already working over capacity. They've got lots of challenges. They've already been underfunded, and that and part of that, they've been trying to service temporary migrants who've been left out of this. So this justification really did not take into account the problems that the agencies already have had in terms of the levels of funding resources that they've been getting. And it's created a very uneven geographical impact, not just in terms of East and West or Central Canada and other parts of Canada, but also in terms of rural and smaller town areas that it seems like they've been hit particularly hard. And in fact, a lot of the special programs by the federal government have been those areas that have targeted northern communities, rural communities, have been cut in this latest round of reformatting what the policies around immigration is going to be. So that sort of variable treatment of agencies certainly adds to the confusion and distress, I think, within the sector. It speaks to the idea of the shift in the funding model and the uncertainty for planning going forward. And there seems to be this, I think, idea by the federal government, by IRCC, that increased competition within the sector and greater efficiencies to be had through such things as distance delivery will create better economies of scale, and that the sector can sort of adjust and sort of do this, which I think is very questionable indeed. So the services, given all of these cuts, are going to decline, but that doesn't mean that the demand is going to decline. In fact, I think what we're going to see is that demand, and I'm sure you'll echo this, has been increasing and will continue to increase. And it does raise questions about the federal government's commitment to facilitating settlement integration going forward, at least at the levels it has had in the past in terms of that support. That this seems to be very much a degrading of that. And it certainly, I think, emphasizes the fact that for temporary migrants, we need to expand the services, not contract these services. Be interesting to see what's going to happen to some of those services that had been extended to temporary migrant groups. What will happen to those going forward? There seems to be lots of indication a lot of those are not going forward, that they are under threat. There is, I think, there was a webinar that was held by IRCC a month or so ago, where they're talking about kind of rationalization of settlement services. And there was lots of, I think, assumptions in that webinar that I was able to attend. And it was one that certainly did not at all take into account two-step migration and the idea of the need for services for temporary migrants. So we seem to be moving towards a leaner service delivery model, which is going to put added stress onto a sector that's already under considerable burdens. And I think it really does also neglect the reality that settlement services are, in fact, an essential service for the country. They really are essential in terms of fostering integration into the country for our large migrant populations. Next slide, please. So I'm going to
John,
move
I
to.
just wanted to alert you that we have about 3 minutes left of our time together.
Good. I'm good. Moving into conclusions, so I'll be quick. So in conclusion, I just want to make the following points. I think obviously in this time period, what's unfortunately happened is attention has been focused away from settlement programming. And so the question is, how do we get heard? Because this is important. How do we get our voices amplified in this? And I think overall the situation places settlement and immigration issues in a very disadvantaged policy position. The federal election for sure is going to be important. Who wins it is important. But I think regardless of the outcome, policy attention is going to be focused away from immigration issues, or certainly settlement issues, and it'll be on trade and borders, but in kind of negative kinds of ways. But having said that, an evidence-based case for broadening the eligibility for settlement services, I think, remains extremely strong. And we really need to build on that evidence-based case and build the case for the inclusion of temporary migrants. And I think the Quebec case, I think, makes a compelling case position here, because Quebec actually as it was resulting in their decisions to lessen the number of immigrants they brought into the province, also expanded the range of the services. So they're in some ways a similar kind of position where they chose a path of expansion to recognize the two-step migration and recognize the important role that temporary migrants play within the province. And I think similar arguments can be made in this case. But obviously, we need to advocate and keep up an advocacy role around this. Next slide, please. So we have 3 recommendations. The first is that I think there is definitely a compelling need to reform IRCC-funded settlement services to include eligibility for all non-permanent migrant residents. And I think this is especially important given the prioritization of temporary residents of Canada for the transition under two-step to permanent residency. As I said, at least 40% of those new permanent residents are planned to come from temporary migrants. Second, services should be adopted to address the diverse needs of temporary residents. One size does not fit all, and settlement agencies on the ground are best positioned to facilitate that sort of what those differences are and how they should look. Third, I think we do need longitudinal research to evaluate the impact of recent initiatives that have provided settlement and integration services to temporary residents. We need to build a qualitative and quantitative evidentiary basis for the funding of those services. I think that's important for the case to be made, the advocacy to be made. Last slide, please, or second last slide. And so importantly, expanding eligibility will buttress the resilience of the immigrant serving sector by expanding its clientele, reducing the resources devoted to accommodating those now considered ineligible, and enhancing the warmth of the welcome in many communities where there are now 2 classes of migrants, the eligible and the ineligible. And the importance of the warmth of the welcome is far more than simply connecting migrants to the labor market, especially to non-skilled commensurate employment. It's about the value of comprehensive wraparound services that work to sustain migrants in more sustaining and holistic ways in their settlement and integration journeys. Settlement services, I would say again, is very much are very much an essential service, as the pandemic has shown, and we need to treat them that way. And the final slide is just a thank you. There we are. We're open.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was such a wonderful presentation, so much information. For those of you that do have other meetings, I just want to point that we are at time. We will be staying on for those of you who can stay. And at this time, we'll kind of open up the floor for some questions. We've got some lovely comments rolling into our chat. A lot of thank yous for the wonderful presentation. And at this point, if you want to raise your hand and unmute your mic, please go for it.
And can I also say my apologies? I'm the one who took too much time. John was dead on time, so I really apologize.
No apologies needed, Valerie. Your section was amazing.
The questions are the best part.
Okay, great. We've got Sarika. Go ahead.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you again. This was very informative for me. I work at the public library. I'm a community learning advocate for newcomer services at Calgary Public Library. And we have always been trying to fill the gaps in the community when it comes to settlement sector and to support settlement service agencies. Now with so many changes and even more coming, we are actually trying to do more. However, we are limited in different ways. So I just wanted to ask if you have time to comment a little bit of how do you see public libraries like helping with, especially I know that like a cutting to link classes are coming, already came. I have to say I was surprised hearing that like in September next year it will stop completely. So if you can comment, how do you see how the public library can support and help even more in that area? Thank you.
John?
Yeah, well, I guess I would start by just saying I think public libraries are an enormous resource that immigrants really use very, very much. And so support for libraries in general is important. We need public spaces. And these are particularly important for immigrant populations, and the resources that are provided by the library staff really important, but also access to computers, access to the information that's available at the library in different languages is really critical. So we need to continue to support those public resources. I think we need to enhance the libraries more because they are a source, and that's one of the areas where city governments become very important. Certainly in terms of the work Valerie and I and the BMRC group have identified public libraries as one of the key organizational resources that build social resilience within society. So again, I can't say enough about the importance of libraries as a source, and especially in smaller communities where there are not the same availability of settlement agencies and so forth. Libraries fill an important gap with regard to that. Valerie, do you want to add?
I would add only one thing. I think one of the key things public libraries do is they bring immigrants into contact with people who are either more established or who were born in Canada, and figuring out those programs that let adults and children with different experiences interact, like the storytelling programs is really key. You guys know more than I do about how to provide information, but it's that letting those encounters take place that's really key. That's what I would encourage libraries to think about. And that's where talking to settlement services can be really helpful because they have some experience with that. They know what their clients need.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate both answers. And that's exactly what we are actually trying to work more on. It is referral, but like at the right referral and way more. So yeah, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate the presentation and everything. I won't take more time from someone else.
Thank you so much. And quickly, just before I jump over to the next question, we have someone in the chat who asked if we're able to share the presentation slides. John and Valerie,
absolutely.
if you're comfortable.
Of course.
Okay, great. So Hanny,
and I also just remind people, go to the BMRC website, and there is a report there that they can also download.
Which much easier to read than to listen to me.
Yeah, the tables are not in, or the figures are not in that report, but the thrust of the presentation and argumentation is in the report on the BMRC website.
Okay, great. And with that, we'll go to Ganif. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this very informative session. I would just like to add one point, maybe it has not been mentioned before. For temporary residents who have a disability, and the service for them. For example, I have open work permit under the Israeli-Palestinian special measurements. In addition to that, we don't have any settlement services. I have a 15 years daughter, autistic, and I cannot apply for FSCD. I cannot apply for any resources. Okay, I applied for DTC and has been approved, but that's, I believe, is not enough. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
The exclusion of temporary residents from the full suite of publicly funded programs in Canada is a hole in the welfare state. I can't tell you how to fill it, but it is well acknowledged that until all residents of Canada get equal access to public services, like daycare subsidies, like subsidized housing, like services for children with different abilities, that we have a hole. And so I'm afraid, Manaf, I can't tell you how to fill it. I think your best bet is to go and seek advice at a local agency, either a settlement agency or an organization that serves children with different abilities, and see what they can help you do, because those organizations are the ones struggling to fill those gaps.
Yeah.
So I don't have a solution.
Yeah, and I think it just points to the why we need to extend those services to the whole of the population that make up our communities and provide essential work within our society. My daughter works in the with disabled, with autistic children, and you know, she of course points out the gaps within that system regularly, and you know, really is not something that we as a society it's a gap that we as a society need to address.
Okay, great. Any other questions or comments as we close up here?
Can I make one comment about this question of why are the Ukrainians being treated differently from other groups?
Absolutely.
It is like the omission of some people from the welfare state services in Canada. Very troubling. And I don't think it has an easy explanation, but I do think that historically the Canadian government has distinguished between people who they see as arriving in Canada to live permanently and people who they see as arriving in Canada to live temporarily. And what we have talked about in this entire presentation is the way that the boundaries between those groups are being blurred. And probably those boundaries should have been questioned from the beginning. And I think the example of what has happened with the Ukrainians versus others really illustrates that contradiction and the need to advocate to remove those boundaries. But I do think it comes out of a very deeply held set of beliefs within our policymaking that have continued for years, and that it will be hard to change. So Jonas, that's my final answer. It's not a good one.
Jonas, go
Thank
ahead.
you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Valerie. I do understand. I got a chance to sit with the former immigration minister, and then even they don't have the answer. But I'm happy. I'm happy that the Ukrainians are just getting that kind of services from our government. But I wish even also just they can have the same services to all the immigrants, especially the Afghans, Sudanese, and the other nationals. Otherwise, I'm just happy that the Ukrainians are just getting, and then
Well,
I know that no one has the answer, and hope that we will have equal treatment.
I mean,
thank you for your
I
answer.
think the positive thing is that the Ukrainian situation provides a precedent for why we should be expanding this to all temporary migrants. So it does set a bit of a precedent that we can use to press forward. But now, whether that's going to move the policymakers is another question. But it is something that we tried to document and say, look, it is being done for other people, for particular groups.
Okay, awesome. So we do have some other comments rolling in. Adanesh says, as a Black person and advocate witnesses, this discrimination in a higher level at the century is unforgettable. Again, kind of pointing to that theme that's coming up of the treatment between Black and brown bodies and white bodies, which I think is very important. We also have Cynthia saying just expressing some appreciation for John and Valerie and everyone who put this together. It's very informative. My brother-in-law had a work permit via his wife, who is an undergraduate student admitted in 2023, and his work permit has not been extended. Wondering if this is a way forward with the government as families are being separated through the process. So Valerie, John, if you have any comments for them.
There is a growing number of people who are experiencing the refusal to extend their work permit, which comes as a total shock. And it's shameful. This situation is happening. Yes, it's true. Nobody is guaranteed a work permit extension, but there was certainly a well-founded reason to expect one. It is how the government is bringing down its temporary resident numbers. And I think the more we talk about this and bring it to public attention, the more likely we might be to be able to stop some of it. I don't know. So I don't know, John, if you have anything to add.
No, I mean, the foreign international student situation far better than I, but I think didn't the government change some of the rules now about spouses coming to country, which is quite problematic in terms of separating and discounting families of temporary residents.
Yeah, most spouses will no longer be eligible for a work permit.
Yeah, that's right.
Going forward. So there's lots of, but this is all an attempt to bring down those numbers.
Yeah.
I have nothing good to say about it.
Did have another comment, Roland, just a thank you. Very informative presentation. Lots to think about moving forward from Julian. Really appreciate the work, insight, and consideration putting this together. So
thank you.
Okay, so with that, we're a few minutes over. I'm happy we got a chance to chat as a community. Thank you for everyone who put a comment or a question out. That's always a wonderful part of these Lunch and Learns. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and start closing out the meeting. So thank you, John and Valerie, so much once again.
Thank you.
That was incredible. Yeah. So thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, great to have a chat.
We got lots of lots of comments, so I'll send them over in an email, John,
Yeah,
just to really
that'd be great.
express my appreciation. So
Yeah, no, we're really happy you found some space for us. So
always, always. Okay, wonderful. I'm gonna go ahead and end the
yeah,
meeting
you
now.
do that, and we'll I'm sure chat in the near future.
Okay, thanks, John.
Keep well. Bye bye.
You too.